In this video I want to show you how the operator synth in Ableton Live works and basically try to explain all the individual functions, knobs and buttons to you. But at the same time I also want to make sure to make it in the most musical way, because it can look quite intimidating, and I want to first focus on the basic principle because it's really important to understand that for this particular synth before then going to dive more into like the detailed parts. And also be known that you can find timestamps, so if you're here for one particular thing, just check them and jump there directly. And otherwise, I'll see you in the video. The most important part of this synthesizer is the oscillator section that you can see on the left side. And if you don't know what some oscillator is, it's basically your main sound generator. And in this case you have 4 of them, and if none of those is selected, we don't have any sound because no sound generator is selected. Now you also need to know that operator is some FM synthesizer, and FM stands for frequency modulation, and it's a different principle compared to some subtractive synthesis, for example with analog, in case you know that synth already. And the main thing here is that we have oscillators that you can hear and oscillators that you can't hear. And this might sound really confusing now, but I want to show you something more visual. So if you click on this menu on the bottom right side, you can pick different algorithms, and to understand it the best we pick the one on the right side, because this is the algorithm where we just, like in a classic synthesizer, hear all the individual oscillators. So now we have A, but we can also bring in B. In this case it's just going to be louder, so we can pick some other waveform. And we have C, we can again select another waveform, and I'll speak about the waveforms more in a second. But we can just treat those individual oscillators individually. Now, if we select some other algorithm, let's say we pick this one that we had in the beginning, it means that the only oscillator we're going to hear is the yellow one, because this is the lowest one. Because with those graphics you'll have to remember that you'll always only hear the oscillator that is on the bottom row, or the oscillators. So in this case we'd only hear like the, let's call it blue and yellow oscillator. In this case we'd only hear the yellow and the purple oscillator, and in this case we'd only hear the yellow, blue and purple oscillator. And let's look at this in some more practical way. So we are going to select this algorithm, go back to our oscillator menu and bring back the volume. So right now we only hear the yellow oscillator, and now this blue one we can't hear, but we can use for modulating this yellow oscillator, because if we increase the volume of this one, you see that our timbre changes. And now the level is basically the intensity of this timbre change, or how audible it is. And that's the basic principle of frequency modulation, because now the B oscillator is modulating the frequency of the A oscillator. And everything we do to the B oscillator we can hear on the A oscillator, because different types of settings change the timbre. So for example, if we select some other waveform, we will have again some other type of timbre. Compared to, for example, this one. And it doesn't stop here, because with this algorithm our purple oscillator again is modulating the blue oscillator. So we can take this further, and if we make changes to, or if we increase the level of the C oscillator, again it has some impact on the sound. And the same would count for the D oscillator. And now you always have to check with this kind of graphic how the modulation works. Because let's for example use this one. Here it would mean that we hear the yellow oscillator, and then we have those 3 oscillators all modulating the yellow one but not modulating each other. So we could start with the B oscillator modulating the yellow one. And then the C oscillator would not modulate the B oscillator but also directly the A oscillator. So we kind of modulate A from different perspectives or angles. And while you have a sound, you can always change the algorithm and just see what happens. Sometimes you get some surprising results. And this was very far from being some great sounding example, but I just wanted to make it obvious. I recommend to start with simple sine waves in the beginning, because you can make incredibly beautiful sounds just using sine waves. And I just loaded the default patch again to look at it a bit more. So now we have this kind of simple routing again, where we only hear the A oscillator. And let's increase slowly the level to check those more settings, because here you can set the chorus, and it's basically, sometimes you think it's some octave button, but it's not. It's just different types of, also not tunings, but it transposes this oscillator. And in the beginning it's octaves, but then sometimes it's fifths and it changes. And just see where it goes. So now we have this one, then we can go here. This one is super nice. And you can already see how many timbres you can get just out of modulating those sine waves with 2 oscillators. And also you have some button for the fine tuning, so this is basically like a detune knob. By the way, in case you feel like you're getting along with synthesizers somehow, but also it's really confusing, because as soon as you see some new synth, it always looks kind of intimidating again, and you just feel like you would like to have this once and for all lesson basically about learning synthesis and the basics, like not about one specific synthesizer, but more in a general way. And that's why I want to warmly invite you to check out a full class that I made about exactly this subject, learning synthesizer basics, in like about 1 hour. And in case you're interested, you find the link down below in the description, also including some little discount code. And you also have some knob for fixed frequency, which means you're basically ignoring the pitch you press on your keyboard, and instead will create the same type of pitch or frequency all the time. So as an example, I'm just going to select it for those both oscillators, and now on my keyboard, I can show you in the MIDI grid, I'm just pressing different notes. And it's always going to be the same sound. And this can be useful if you need one layer that maybe does something percussive and you want it to produce the exact same sound all the time, while you maybe play pitches with some other layer. And here it's going to be really useful. And by changing the frequency, you basically change the tone. So if you do it like in this case with 2 oscillators, you can then again have some interplay of 2 different tones that creates the kind of unique timbre of this frequency modulation. And this multiplier basically multiplies this one with the amount here. So if it's at 1, nothing happens, but at 10, you see it actually here on the bottom row, that now it says fixed frequency actually 4210. So you basically also just get some additional timbres. It's always about getting additional timbres. Now, all our oscillators have some individual envelopes, so no matter if it's some oscillator we can hear or if it's just some modulating oscillator, they all have their individual envelope. And if you're new to envelopes, let me quickly give you some introduction. So right now I just have selected oscillator A. We don't hear anything else, no modulation. And you always have the attack phase, which means how fast your sound will be there. Right now it's at 0, so the sound is there right away. If I increase this, we get a little swell. Then you have some sustain amount, which basically means at what level the sound stays when you keep the note pressed. And in order to get there after the attack has reached the final peak here, there's also going to be some decay that determines how soon the sound will decay. And if I press this, you see, actually, let's make it a bit longer. You will see that now there will be a decay phase. And now it stays at this value because this is our sustain. It's very soft, but it's still playing. And when I release the note, we still have the release, which determines how long the tone is going to be ringing out after I release the key. And because all those oscillators have their individual envelope, we can do super unique movements through using this. So for example, for our A oscillator, let's make the most basic envelope. So it's just the sound that is there right away, and I can just release it and then it's gone, so there's no movement. But then we're going to use B, and B is going to have some longer attack, let's say like around 2 seconds, and also long decay, before it goes down again. And now you can hear that this kind of modulation takes place over time. So just listen. Now it's the long decay phase. And you can also make this shorter, so you have this kind of little, often you use this for like brass sounds in the beginning. And this is just so cool. And maybe you know other synthesizers, like subtractive synthesizers like analog, where it's about having your oscillators and taking away frequencies. And you can see here that the filter is selected, but it doesn't have any impact because it's just not fully open, but kind of fully open. So I can also deselect it. And what you can do with the filter during subtractive synthesis, you can actually do with those envelopes with the FM synthesis, because you can use all those envelopes and those modulations for creating all those kind of textural movements and changes and colors without ever touching a filter. And those are the very basics of the operator synth, and also generally classic FM synthesizers, like it would also be the Yamaha DX7. And if you're new to this, I really recommend just spending a good amount of time now just experimenting with the relationship between the oscillators, with the different algorithms, with different envelopes, to just get a feeling for the types of tones that you can create this way. Nevertheless, there are way more settings inside the synthesizer and way more possibilities for actually fine-tuning your sound. So that's what we're going to look at in the second part of the video now. First, let's have a closer look at the oscillator section, because there's quite some interesting stuff you can do. And for now, I just selected the A oscillator. I mean, those are selected, but as you can see, they don't reach the sound here because the second one is deselected. And now we can click on this oscillator button and see this weird graphic here. And what you can do here is basically draw your own waveforms, because you have waveforms here and you can choose, maybe you know, just some sawtooth wave. And even here you have sawtooth waves with different amounts of, you say, harmonics. So like 64 means you have harmonics all the way filled up or filling up all those spaces, while you also have a simple sawtooth wave. And basically you can think of harmonics as the more harmonics you get, the brighter, or not necessarily brighter, but just the richer the sound is. So check this sawtooth wave with just 3 harmonics compared to the one with 64. So it's basically more frequency content. That's actually what I was looking for. And instead of choosing one here, you can also draw your own ones. And it's good to understand that the first one is always going to be like your classic sine wave. And you see here a graphic, so as soon as you start drawing, you see what it actually does to your waveform. So this would now be this waveform. It can sound really sick, but at the same time, that's the fun of it, because I mean, there's always a logic to those harmonics, but I'm not too much about always understanding exactly like the logic. I'm more like intuitive and just like playing around and see how those timbres sound. A good thing to know though is that you can divide those into even and odd harmonics. So if you right click on this graphic, you can, for example, use even, and then you see you can't draw everywhere. You can only draw every other slot, or into every other slot. And odd and even basically means the even harmonics sound a little more harmonic, probably for your ears, and the odd harmonics have a little more tension and are just basically some intervals that are not as pleasant as those harmonic ones, because in the end those are also always just intervals and overtones, but you should go into music theory and overtones if you really want to understand this. For now, let's just check how this sounds with the even harmonics. Compared to the odd harmonics. And you can also take your time to really understand the sound of each of those individual slots. You can also divide it into just 16, 32 or 64. It's maybe simpler in the beginning with just 16. And then see, because if you take time to explore it, you hear that it actually creates those intervals. And you wouldn't necessarily think of it this way if you just hear the waveform right away. But yeah, I really recommend playing around with this, but also don't make it too complicated. It's meant to be some intuitive tool, at least in my opinion. And it's also interesting to see that with a sawtooth wave, you basically fill up all those individual slots, and you can also call them partials. I haven't mentioned this name yet. And this is why it sounds so like rich in frequencies. And if you look at the square wave, you see it's only the odd harmonics, which might be the reason it sounds a little more aggressive and in situations even harsh. And if you're drawing your own waveforms, you can also change the setting for repeat, which is basically some additional algorithm for how those partials are going to be played. So I think the lowest one makes it a bit brighter compared to the highest one, pointing out more like the low frequencies. Or actually rolling off the high end. Actually, there's always a good explanation if you open this menu on the left side. And for those things, try to read them because they are sometimes more accurate than I can be. But just see this as, again, if you're trying to think simple, some additional chance to impact your timbre. But again, I must say that you're really good in the beginning just working with sine waves with the operator, because already with just sine waves there are so many interesting timbres to explore. So you shouldn't freak out about this, and it's totally fine to ignore this for like the first year of using operator, in my opinion. By the way, in case you also feel like having some more classic sound library of synth patches for Ableton Live that contain just some useful sounds that are at the same time simple but also usable and flexible, so you can easily turn them into your own presets, I want to invite you to check out a little sound library that I just released containing some synth patches for Ableton Live. And they are also great for learning, so you can look into them, how they've been created. And there's a link down below in the description where you can find this pack, also preview all the sounds, and also it contains a little discount code. Let's look at those additional settings. So phase always basically means the starting point of your waveform, and if you change this, you see that it moves. So for example, here, if it starts here, you get this kind of punch in the beginning, while if I start here, it sounds softer. And retrigger means that it always starts the waveform from the same position. So if this is deselected, it will basically oscillate freely, and you don't really know where you start when you press a key. So sometimes it's harsher, sometimes less harsh, so that's why I recommend using retrigger in order to control your sound the most. Then you can also have your oscillator react to the velocity of your playing in terms of how it affects the pitch. Because now I'm just playing the same note, and if I increase this, I'm using different velocities. This is really a function for you if you're into experimenting and maybe want to have like one oscillator that makes some free sound. Otherwise, I don't really use this option, but it's fun for sure. And with a Q, you always quantize. So if this is deselected, it's more like some super free frequency shifter compared to here having at least some actual pitches that could be written down on sheet music if you feel like it. The feedback only works if your oscillator is not being modulated, so we can select this algorithm here. And since now there's no modulating oscillator for A, we can use feedback. And it basically means that since there's no modulating oscillator around, it just uses itself. So if I increase this, you also get some modulation. Now if we go back to the envelope, there's also some interesting setting called time and velocity, because if you increase this, it means that once you play with a softer velocity, your envelope rate is going to be multiplied. Okay, this sounds really abstract. It basically means that you get longer values for all your settings. I mean, for the attack it's at 0, so it doesn't work, but you can see now if I play softly that we get some longer release, for example. Whereas when I play with a higher velocity, it's short again. And so for the attack, if we increase it a little, I think it should also work. This is soft velocity, and this is high velocity. So if you're into having lots of reactions to your playing, because you're some person that likes expression a lot while playing on your keyboard, this can be a super cool setting to explore. Then it's also the classic velocity function that you can say how much it reacts to your velocity in terms of how loud it is, because if it's at 0, all your notes are going to have the same velocity, and if you increase it, it's going to be more dynamic. And if it's at 100, it's going to be crazy dynamic and almost unplayable because it's so sensitive, but it's really up to you to find the sweet spot here. And the keyboard tracking is basically also the reaction of the amplitude or the velocity to where you place. And for hearing this, I've set the velocity to 0, so now the change in loudness just comes from like where I play it. So if I play some single scale, you can hear that it actually gets louder over time. And that's how keyboard tracking works, and you can also do it the other way around. And just a little practical tip in personal preference, I usually don't like to use keyboard tracking for the oscillator that you hear, and just a little bit of the velocity, but I like to use it more for the modulating oscillator. So now I changed back to the setting where we kind of modulate A with B, and we have this kind of sound. And if you add some keyboard tracking now, it's basically like filter keyboard tracking, because the higher you go, the more of the modulation gets applied, and therefore the brighter the sound will get. Can make it a bit more extreme. And also, I like to add some more velocity reaction here, because this way you can just control your sound in a way that you can play softly for like a duller sound, and with a higher velocity for some brighter sound. Actually, we need more of this. Just as a little example. Also for this envelope, you can set the initial starting point. So if you have some slow attack, for example, you can say you don't want to start all the way at the bottom, so just set some higher point. So now actually this is the envelope for the modulating oscillator. Now it creates this kind of slow swell, but we can also just start a bit higher. So there's more of it right away. And also you can set the peak for the attack, so it doesn't have to go all the way up, but this one always is kind of a balancing act with how much of the amount you want to add. And there's not only one single way. Usually you can also just decrease the amount here if you want less intensity, instead of maybe reducing the peak. But yeah, this is really some tool to experiment with, and I just show you the tools so you can just explore them for yourself. And a last thing about the envelopes, but actually a super fun thing, is that you can create some rhythmical loops. So let's just activate the A oscillator and make some snappy short envelope. So right now we just have this percussive sound, but if we select loop now, we can have a loop, but based on milliseconds, so this way it's not synced to our metronome, which always is a bit tricky, but this works when you select beat. So you can select 16th notes, for example. And the same goes for sync, but here it actually syncs with your metronome. So if I now turn on the metronome and actually play the metronome, it will always sync it again to the click. Even if I change like in between, then you just have one note that is in between, but then on the next step it kind of syncs again to the metronome, whereas the beat setting is completely free. And you also have a trigger mode, which basically means that you bypass your sustain. So even if the sustain here would be high, and I'm still pressing the note right now, but it only reacts to the decay. So if the decay is short, it doesn't matter that our sustain is like all the way to the top. We just have this kind of short sound, and this is really useful for percussion sounds that you still play, but you don't want the sound to react to your sustain, because since you're playing, you might press the keys sometimes a little longer. And this way you just get the same kind of attack or decay or basically punch all the time. Next, let's check the LFO, and LFO stands for low frequency oscillator, and it's a bit like with those modulating oscillators that it's like some oscillator you can't hear. And again, you can modulate other stuff with it. So for example, it has a first routing that is always set by default, which means that you can select or deselect those individual oscillators and modulate their pitch. So if I select A, I mean it was selected already, and I apply some amount, you see, that the pitch kind of wobbles and you hear it better if you make a slower rate. And you can see, since we're using a sine wave, it just, as a wave, kind of goes up and down in pitch. And it becomes more aggressive if you, for example, use some square wave. Then it just changes. And the same for like, actually the triangle wave is a little between square wave and sine wave. And you have sawtooth waves. And fun is always the sample and hold, because it's like some random generator. You get those kind of evil melodies. And also you got some noise, which is, yeah, also great if you just want to have some more glitchy or less perfect sound effects. Make it a little destroyed. And also for the rate, this is now on low, but you can also make it faster by, for example, picking some high setting. And here you get almost some distortions that can be really fun to play with. Almost like some noise generator. And also you can sync it to your beat. So and you can set the amount here, but also here. Both things do kind of similar things. Again, this is one of those balancing things. And also here you can apply it to the filter in case you use it, but we'll look at the filter next. And destination B is like your spot where you can pick whatever else you want to modulate. So again, you have some filter settings. You can also again self-modulate the LFO, but I'm not going to go through all of those. You can experiment with them for yourself, but they are kind of self-explanatory. So just be known that here you can modulate anything you wish for. And also it can react to your velocity. So if you play loud, you have more of the LFO compared to a soft velocity where you have less. Which can also be actually cool for certain sounds. And actually the rate can react to the key. So if you play some lower note, it's slower than if you play some higher note. If you use those gently, they can actually add some very interesting touch to your sounds, I think. And then again, the LFO has some envelope and it works exactly the same way as all the other envelopes. You also have this time-velocity relation I've explained to you already for the oscillators. And what I like it most for is to just add some attack, because sometimes it sounds nice if the LFO doesn't come in right away. So this way you kind of delay it a little and can have some first impact of the sound, while then your kind of sustain gets this little wobbliness. So that's something I like to use it for. And actually, yeah, initial peak, it's the same. Also, you can set a loop for your LFO, which is really funky if you have like both some LFO that is already rhythmical, but then has a loop at the same time. And the end is additional, but here you can basically say that it stays on the same amount even if you release the key. Otherwise, you can even have some designated reaction to what happens if you release the key, but also this way would be the most classic way of some LFO. And it also has a retrigger button, and it's exactly the same as it was with the waveform, that once it's selected, it will always start the LFO at the same position. I've selected some slower speed now for demonstration purposes. If it's not selected, there's a chance that you always start at some different position with your sound. As you can see here. Next we have a filter, and as I mentioned, for FM synthesis, I usually like to not even use the filter in many situations, but it's also nice to have it. And the most basic thing is basically that you always have the filter frequency, which basically means you can take away frequencies from your sound. So if I play, actually let's make it a bit brighter. And now we basically make it duller. And we also have the resonance, which means it creates some additional frequency boost. So you can get some, sometimes more charismatic, but also some more nasty tones. And it's always in some interplay between frequency and resonance to kind of find a sweet spot. There's cool stuff to find. And you also have different types of filters, because like this, we're just taking away like the high frequency content, but you can also do it the other way around by taking away the low frequency content. Kind of interesting. And this one means we just have like some frequency around, in this case, 577. That is used, and it takes both like the low end and the top end of this frequency away. So it's a very thin sound. And this is a notch filter, which is just the opposite, that it takes something away at the frequency you choose here. And then you also get some filter type called morph. And you can see that once we kind of change the morph value here that appears, that it's basically, yeah, some morphing kind of thing. And it gets interesting if you modulate it, because under LFO you can see that under destination B you have the, where is it, filter morph. And then you can just play around and get those kind of morphing effects. Then there are also different types of intensities for the filter. So for example, 12 means it takes away 12 decibel per octave. It's a lighter filter compared to 24, because here you can see we have less frequency content, because although we take it away at the same point, it's going to be steeper. And you can also see it with this curve here. And also we can distort the filter by using some distortion mode. You have 4 different ones. I often like the PRD mode. And as soon as we select this, we can add some filter drive here. And get this kind of distorted sound. Actually, with the FM synth like operator, I often prefer using the filter just for adding the distortion and not necessarily like some big envelope or something. But we'll get to this also in a second. You can also select a shaper. Basically here you can also get some distortion, depending also on how much you send in, and you can even send in more through the shaper drive. And here you have to be careful because it can be really loud. But it's cool if you just need some boost in whatever sound you have, or you want to experiment with some very aggressive sounds. It's a great section for it. And let's actually go back to something normal. And also your frequency can react to your velocity. So if you play with a soft velocity, you have a kind of a duller sound. While if you play with a higher velocity, it's like fully there, as an extreme example. And frequency key, this is actually also something useful, because this is the keyboard tracking we also used for the modulation oscillator. I was showing it to you. And as some extreme example, I just put it to 200, and here you can see that our low notes are actually really dull, although I press really hard, and then we go higher. And here they are way louder, or actually open the filter more. So that's what you can do here. You can also apply some filter envelope, and again, those envelope settings are exactly the same as they were for like the LFO or the oscillators. And in order to hear it, you also need to increase the intensity, like here, the envelope amount. And since now we have a short envelope, we'll just get some like more enhanced attack, like this. Actually, it's a bit too much. And this is more the classic synthesis type of thing. And also you have this time velocity kind of thing that you can use for some reaction to your playing, as I've mentioned in the oscillator section. And if you click on this top row, you can also have some more access on the slopes. So here, for example, for the attack, you can change the slope and have those exponential curves, also for the decay. And for the release, once you see it, the sustain has to be up. So here you can see that you can change the release slope. And again, the peak, I've shown you already that you can do the same here with the filter and the initial. Also, you can loop it. So there's a lot of loops you can program for the synthesizer, almost make it some one-man band, but there's actually a topic for some other video. And also you can tell it to actually not go down, so it stays on the top all the time, or do weird stuff like when there's the release that the filter actually opens. And another good example for understanding the filter envelope is always to make it slow, so have some attack of maybe 2 seconds, and to see how it slowly kind of sweeps in, and the envelope here has to be selected, or at least needs to have some certain amount. But it's a kind of similar effect you can create by doing the modulation with one of those modulation oscillators. But this way you can just use those different parts for individual things. So theoretically you can create really complex patches this way. Next we have the pitch envelope, which just adds some movement to your pitch in the beginning of your sound. And it basically adds this kind of spacey kind of thing. You can also change the intensity here. You can either draw with your mouse or change the values here. The higher you go, the more intensity you actually get. And the shorter the decay, also the more snappy it is. You can get those kind of percussive attacks that are extremely important for creating drum sounds. And again, you can make it loop, which is actually also very funky, because you basically add some constant punch to your sound. So with those loop envelopes, there's really a lot of stuff to explore, and it's impossible to cover this all in this video because I just want to show you those basic functions. And then again, you can fine-tune it also with the sustain. You can actually put it 48 semitones because ST is for semitones. This means that you will actually go way lower than your pitch is. And in the end, it goes up again because here you can see that we have the release that actually goes up, but you can also put it down. So if you put the sustain of the pitch envelope down, you basically transpose your whole figure, in this case 4 octaves down, which is why it's so low. And for example, we can create something that goes into the direction of a kick drum by just having this short pitch envelope and just some snappy envelope for our one oscillator. And we don't need the LFO. And yeah, we could tweak this further, but this is kind of the direction you use for creating drum sounds, or in this particular case, like kick drum sounds. And the initial is kind of irrelevant unless you want to, again, have some attack, because you can have the pitch envelope be, yeah, basically some additional envelope. You can have so many envelopes here. So you can have this whoop in the beginning. And this way, get those kind of sweeps as well. And you can also decide to not use this as some pitch envelope at all, because I mean by default they are sending this envelope to the oscillators, but you can just deselect it. So instead you can just pick any destination here and use this envelope to modulate something else and just not use it as a pitch envelope. Then you also have the glide, and you can deselect the pitch envelope button here and still access the glide, which basically means your tone slides to the next one. And this is the time. So if it's short, it's just a short glide. Or you can have those super long glides. And this works best if you select some monophonic sound where you only have one sound at a time and not a polyphony, but we'll look at this in the last section where we look at the global settings. For now, let's not use this and look at the spread, which is some nice chorusing effect, just makes your tone a little wider because it creates this kind of thing called unison detune, which just sounds like you have more voices than you actually have. And it's like a more stereo kind of sound. That is really pleasant. Also be careful to not overdo it, because sometimes if you do it with a lot of sounds, you just lose a bit your depth, or actually your center. But especially for like pad sounds or beautiful cinematic sounds, it's always great to just add a little bit. And transpose is basically your global transposition button, so you can just transpose it some octave lower or higher, so that's really basic stuff. Now let's check the global settings, and I have explained to you those algorithms on the top already. Then underneath you can just add additional reactions to like velocity, then the keyboard tracking, what I explained, that like it reacts on where you play on your keyboard. Aftertouch I don't have on my small MIDI keyboard here, it's when you press the key once more after you already pressed it. Pitch bend and mod wheel are those two things that you most of the time have on the upper left side of your keyboard. And then you can basically decide what you want those to do. And sometimes here with the pitch, for the pitch bend, it's already pre-selected, but you can also do your own stuff. And at some point it feels like all those options were there already, because you have velocity for OSC volume, but you have the same setting under the oscillators, and you have, for example, like the LFO amount, but you can also earlier say that it shall react to your velocity. So often you have like 2 or 3 places where you can select the same things. But if you haven't done something yet where you feel like you would also like your velocity to have some impact on that's basically where you can do it. And once you select something, you have to make sure to also increase the amount. So let's say with our mod wheel, we want to control the LFO amount. And then here you have to increase this value and also activate the LFO in this case. Let's say we want to just modulate our pitch. And now I have to increase the mod wheel to actually hear it. And if the amount here is on 100, it means like if this kind of device, in this case the mod wheel, is not doing anything, although the LFO has some high amount, we don't hear it yet. So this is now kind of the master control for the LFO amount. And as soon as you use some lower values here, you'll also hear the LFO in this case a little, although the mod wheel amount will still be 0. So now there's no mod wheel, but you can hear we hear some LFO. So if you want the effect to be there all the time, you have to make sure that this is not at 100. Then on the bottom row, you can select the amount of voices. And as I mentioned, sometimes it's cool to have just one voice, especially for bass sounds, because this way you can make sure you don't have weird overlapping frequencies, because they can sound really ugly in the lower register. And let me just quickly open the MIDI grid. So now I play one note, and as soon as I play the next one, this first one is actually cut off, but if I play it again, it jumps to this one and replaces the upper one. And that's basically how it always works. So also if we have, for example, 4 voices selected, and so I play one note in the bass and 3 more. So this is our maximum polyphony. And now I add some 5th note, and it takes the bass note away, because this was the first one we pressed. And once the polyphony is reached, it always takes away the note that you played first. So this is kind of how the synth prioritizes your notes. Then with those 3 ones, I would just leave them this way unless you have some CPU problems, but I feel like it's not really an issue with the synth. But in case, just try switching those to some other setting. Actually, the settings you can read here on the left side are more accurate than what I can tell you. But this is basically to make the life easier for the synth, but I feel like it's not CPU heavy anyway, so usually you should never worry about those. And then you can also change the panning, simple stuff, and also fun stuff like the keyboard tracking applies to the panning. So this means if you play lower notes, it's more like on one side, while higher notes go more actually to the other side then, but I find this a bit gimmicky. But sometimes maybe for some patches it can be cool. And you can also add some random panning, so now you never know. And this is some great effect that you can use, especially for like arpeggio sequences. So this is something you should probably remember. And then on the menu itself, on the bottom right side of the synth, we also have the time switch, and it's basically like this time versus velocity thing you remember from the envelopes, but just global, which means if we increase this, we overall have some longer envelopes. And if we decrease it, we have some overall shorter envelopes. It's a great control for also some macros if you want some parameters to be controlled with a MIDI controller. I really like this and find it incredibly helpful. Then the tone is just some little button for color, so if it's all the way up, you get a brighter sound. And I mean all of this on a global level, or you get some kind of more muffled sound, so also a great control for some potential MIDI controller. And yeah, volume is just volume, self-explanatory. And now you basically know about all those settings and can try making cool sounds with it. And if you need some inspiration, there's a video here and another one here where I make sounds with Operator. Otherwise, remember those links I mentioned, you can find them down below in the description. And apart from that, I wish you lots of inspiration with whatever it is that you create, and really hope to see you soon again at this channel. Bye!